10:01, let's rock and roll. Welcome to the fourth installment of the Hammerdown Podcast. My name is Jay Mervis, Senior Director of Healthcare Sales here at Fortinet. Welcome to the fourth installment of our podcast series. I'm here with Nathan Nichols, Healthcare Solution Architect nationally here at Fortinet. Nate, why don't you give us a little bit about yourself? Welcome to the show. Glad to have you on. This is fortunate to work with you every day, so this is nothing foreign for us. But why don't you tell the world a little bit about Nate Nichols?
Sure. So I'm the healthcare solutions architect for the healthcare vertical team here at Fortinet. I think I've been here. I think I'm on month 15 or 16. It's kind of like having a little kid. At some point, you've got to transition to years. I'm almost to where I can say I'm a 2-year-old, right? So before that, I've worked in healthcare for about 17 years as a network architect for a health system here in Oklahoma. I think at our peak, there were some divestitures and some acquisitions. At one point, 14 hospitals and about 70 clinics. And after that, I worked for an electrical utility here in Oklahoma, also covered part of Arkansas, helped do some of the architecture for their field area network upgrade. If you go way before that, worked in software development, QA for software, actually was a Unix admin for several years. Was involved in that in the internet service provider world and in the financial services vertical as well. So, and anyway, I'm now on the other side of the table, on the vendor side, which is kind of interesting. A lot of what I do is trying to map together what we do from a product and solution perspective to the problems that healthcare organizations see. Which the interesting thing is, I saw this when I worked in healthcare and go to conferences and stuff. The problems and the challenges and the dysfunction and the things that do work are almost always similar across organizations. It's just the same story, different names. So I think there's a lot of value in that 16, 17 years I have, being able to sit down and talk to people and say, what are you dealing with? Yep, had that same problem, or this is what we did. This is what I know doesn't work. Actually, I found that what I screwed up probably gives me a lot more usefulness in terms of being able to relate than what I did right. So that's my 2-minute where I came from and who I am, and that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So
well, hey, that's awesome. And like I said, I have the fortune of working with you every day. We've matured as a group. The first thing we worked on was a radiology project and point of view, kind of building that plan as it's taken off. In a year plus since then, we've matured. You've put together a lot of our reference architecture, multi-vendor solution things. And we've done some amazing things helping customers out and scaling our practice with the growth that we've seen. So, appreciate you working together tightly every day. Love delivering messages to customers. We've had, pack them up in planes, trains, automobiles, and let's hit the road and make it happen. So put the hammer down, pedal to the metal. Today's trend, we're going to talk ransomware. So, we've done multiple sessions with customers, or we've done roundtables with partners and done some, major trade shows and talked ransomware because it's front and center, top of mind to everybody that we talk to. It's one of the biggest threats in the healthcare space right now. The threat actors, they're just getting more sophisticated. Instead of spraying and praying, targeted attacks, threat vectors, work from home, work from anywhere, consuming from the cloud, consuming on-prem, the digitization of healthcare. We see those downtimes. We've talked about this with pharmacy operations. Nobody has pads of paper for their downtime operations on neonatal, elective surgeries, scheduling, and then the most wild card one is voice gets shut down in hospitals. A huge problem. So what are a couple of the techniques, Nate, that, when we talk to customers, you advise them on, to get in front of ransomware?
Yeah, so there's a whole full court press that I wish everybody would do, but I kind of look at it. You kind of have to pick a direction to start looking at the landscape. I'm still a huge believer in protecting the endpoint. Some of that may come from my background as a Unix sysadmin. I was used to having mail servers sitting out, not unprotected, but just kind of naked on the internet. And if you didn't protect them, they were toast, right? So I still think where you can, you really got to have a good AV, good EDR, good products and configuration on those endpoint devices. So healthcare's full of Windows PCs, and not trying to pick on Windows. I mean, it's you've got to keep up on, it is what it is. You got to keep up on your updates. Used to people say, hey, Mac doesn't get that. Well, yeah, you get stuff now because they're popular. But make sure that you have really good posture on those and have them in a condition where they're going to be able to withstand that. So for example, if you take our EDR product, from a ransomware perspective, it can watch a process, and maybe the process is doing some things that could be considered benign, and then and it maybe it's something it's brand new, right? And then all of a sudden it's recognized for doing malicious activity. We can do a rollback with that. So I think it's important to have that on the host side of it. And that's great. I think from the next step, if you start walking back from that direction, is this concept of least privilege. And that can get into multiple things. Like, for example, we can start talking about zero trust network access. But I think even from a more basic level, look at permissions, right? I see, we have you see applications that use a Windows share, and it's just, sometimes it's easier to say, give it all the users full control of that Windows share, and the application will work great, right? But the reality is you just made a big room for that ransomware to run around in, and a big intersection for it to spread further out. So the whole concept of least privilege, only allow the minimum of what an application and user has to have. And that's the same thing with zero trust network access, right? It's the whole concept of being able to automate that and being able to have those network pathways dynamically constructed and allowed. But again, that also gets into identity and all that, where I think you need to be able to say, from a user and application perspective, am I overreaching? Am I allowing too much? So the next part of this would be segmentation. So it's and segmentation's been around it's a concept that's been around for a long time, right? So a lot of people, they think of VLANs, which really is, the basic form of segmentation. A lot of times, most medical devices, you can't stick an EDR and AV client on it, right?
We don't want a procedure to get shut down when somebody, because it's Tuesday morning patch. That's
absolutely
something we talk to customers about. But yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah, absolutely. You don't want to be in the middle of a heart cath procedure and having a cardiologist or a cardiosurgeon directing a catheter up through your heart and having his screen go blank, right? From AV being a little overzealous, right? And a lot of vendors, for good reason, they'll have restrictions on what you put on that. So at this point, you have to kind of wrap things in bubble wrap a little bit, which is fine. So at that point, you have a controlled in and out of that. I think the important thing with segmentation is you need to make sure it's correct. You need to know what's in your segment. You need to make sure that things that shouldn't be there aren't there, and vice versa. And then also, we can do microsegmentation. So if you could do that with our switches, I think you're even better off, because you don't want a VLAN that's just a free for all again. So the next part of that, so this kind of goes into from segmentation. From segmentation, you've got things in a nice little container, a little box. You got all your infusion pumps, your PCs that are related to the lab, all these things in these little segments or these little VLANs or whatever. And that's great. But within that, if you're not doing microsegmentation, or let's say you are, there's some free space in that, right? If you can visualize this in terms of white space, and can you see what's going on within there? You can with microsegmentation, but it's kind of an adjacent thing here. So this gets into one of the things I've talked to customers more and more about, which is deception technology.
Oh, let's just transition right to the tech. Deception.
Let's just go. Yeah.
So FortiDeceptor, right? And stay in 1 second on the segmentation. There's an initiative at most customers to start doing that, because a lot of the compromises are for the ransomware happens because of the resource constraints. There's not enough people, 1 million plus jobs now identified by the FBI. So those kind of things, so how do we get in front of it, right? And if we transition to tech right now, is deception technology. So when we see deception technology, the market's growing 14% a year. They're talking this is going to double by 2025, that this is going to be a critical component in your cybersecurity strategy. And so, when customers want to adopt 90%, we, lead with the fabric that we can connect all this threat intelligence with multiple products. But Nate, let's talk FortiDeceptor on how it applies to healthcare.
Yep. So what FortiDeceptor is, I've been trying to think of a better word than honeypot, but that's probably the closest thing that people are familiar to, right? So if I think back to my days working for an internet service provider, we had these big mail servers that we supported, and spam was getting, got worse over time. I mean, we're still how many pieces of spam do we get a day?
Hey,
right?
just so everybody knows, our address for the team is healthcare at Fortinet and pharma at Fortinet. So go ahead and reach out to us at any point in time. But the spammers love us, so we all see, in triplicate. It's like having paper forms again on a dot matrix printer. But yeah, spam.
Yeah. So unfortunately, we have some apparatus to take care of that. But one of the early uses of honeypots was to put fake mail servers out and to be able to see, okay, who are the senders that are sending this junk? Who are people that are probing for open SMTP servers, right? And then you saw that kind of move into organizations that had their own to kind of see who's poking at my DMZ, who's poking at my services at the edge, right? To be able to maybe have a dynamic block list. Now we're seeing this used internally in the networks, inside of networks, right? So if we go back to what Deceptor is, think of Deceptor as kind of like a hypervisor for honeypots, right? So you take Deceptor, and let's take a clinical device VLAN, right? So let's say you've got infusion pumps, and not picking on infusion pumps, it's just you have tons
There's a lot
them
of
in hospitals.
I mean, they're out there at scale, and nurses hide them. And if you don't know where something is, you can't protect it. So identifying the devices on one end, but the Deceptor, infusion pumps.
Yeah. So Deceptor. So let's say you take that segment or that VLAN that you have those infusion pumps in, and you've got a lot of unused IP space likely in that, or available subnet that's assigned to that VLAN. Let me be correct in my network engineering here. So what you can do with Deceptor is you can give it access to that VLAN. It can go through, it can take an inventory of what's running in here in that VLAN. And you can say, well, this is if you don't see this IP range being used, go ahead and spin me up some fake infusion pumps, right? Or whatever, whatever. There's a whole list of devices. I'm not doing it any justice because there's a ton of OT related. There's you can emulate a PAC system. There's all kinds of things that you can emulate. And essentially it can adopt those IP addresses and listen on those IPs and present a decoy that if a threat attacker finds their way into that segment, they can interact with that like they would a real device. Now, the nice thing with this is we can now watch the activity from that attacker. We can configure actions. So this integrates with our fabric, and that's a whole other discussion, right? Which our products we make an effort to tie them together, and even other vendors' products, right? Deceptor actually works with a lot of other vendors' products as well. So let's say maybe we want to go ahead and kick off a ServiceNow ticket. We want to raise an alert to our SOC. We want to quarantine the source IP, or we want to cut them off at the knees, right? So there's a whole host of things that we can do with that. The nice thing about Deceptor is there's really no false positives in that, right? So if you think of traditional monitoring, there's so much network traffic going on in healthcare organizations. Sometimes you have to kind of read between the lines, right? And say,
right,
okay, this is a print management server that's scanning for new printers or something goofy like that. Whereas if you've got somebody trying to brute force a web administration interface, or they get in and they're poking around at settings, they shouldn't be doing that, right?
Right.
And this gets into, a lot of times you have active controls and you have monitoring controls. Active controls are fantastic. But in terms of like firewall rules and things like that, but sometimes you can make a change that can have a little more effect than you wanted, or unintended effects, right? The nice thing about Deceptor is you have this somewhat passive sitting there and waiting, this mousetrap type control that can, if it gets triggered, it is more than likely 99% legitimate. And then you can start the machinery to remediate that or to take evasive action. So anyway, I know that was the long way around that whole discussion on how this works. I wish I need to get a whiteboard in here. Right. But the other thing worth mentioning on this too is there's also the concept of tokens, which is essentially having an agent or an apparatus on an actual production type device that let's say somebody's poking in a legitimate Windows workstation, and you can have a fake SMB share on that that is really not visible to the user. The user doesn't really know it's there. They're doing the regular work, but an attacker sees that or starts prodding that machine and sees that, it can raise the alarm, because deception's great, but you don't want to just leave it to chance and just say, hope they pick the decoy instead of something real. So we also have that whole surface of detection there to include active machines or real machines in the environment. So, and then go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I like the deception because some of the major compromises we've had, Microsoft is very prevalent. I mean, I know you're beating up on Windows PCs, but Office 365 is, business moves with mail and Excel and Word and all that, and everybody's got this, right? And when everybody's got to log into two-factor authentication or a Microsoft portal, physicians are notorious for clicking their phone and saying, I was tired of the alert, when they didn't go and originate the alert. They haven't looked at a Word document in 12 years, right? So one of those things in our Deceptor, pre-canned, I guess, or pre-built that we can customize for a customer is a lot of the Microsoft services, the two-factor authentication portals that have been compromised. That's probably number 5 or 6 on the list of ransomware attacks. We can get in front of understanding who's trying to compromise the environment. So
yeah, it's, and the thing is too, is we can also deploy, you can take your regular clinical workstation image and deploy it. So, I mean, you can really, really customize this. It's not like I've just got a bunch of generic things out there. You can fill the white space in your environment to where you've created a minefield for an attacker that's internal. We've actually, and this is something we've actually seen success. We've had Deceptor find active threat actors within environments, and it's incredibly easy to set up. It's not complicated. Literally, you give it access to VLANs. We've had customers deploy it in under half a day.
I mean, they've all complained that it takes them longer to order it.
Yeah. Well, and what's interesting, I've had customers ask, okay, well, how many FTEs do we need to consider dedicating to this? I'm like, really, when you think about it, it's going to give you a net positive here, because think about the fact that there's really not there's not false positives. There's not false detections in that. In terms of your other tools, your other monitoring type products that all feed up, and you have to either manually correlate or use a SIM or something to figure out, okay, what all does this mean together in the story? It doesn't lie, right? So other than deploying and doing regular software updates like any other product, it's kind of the TCO is really low, right? So it's a really neat product. I think it's one of those things where people aren't used to this type of product in an environment, but I think it needs to become normal. I think more people are looking at it and realizing, okay, this is a force multiplier for us in terms of if there's something really going on, that we're not behind the timeline and behind the ball on that. So
yeah. And I mean, it's interesting because we talk a lot about resource constraints tying into ransomware, tying into, we have some of our things between Troy, you, myself, the rest of the team, like, hey, ROI, TCO, FTEs, how do I get, who are we going to fire? Like, no, you don't have enough people anyway. We're trying to automate something, connected into, a sandbox, have it detonate, but the, fake patient portal, certain customers, they don't even use their patient portal anymore, clinical trials. So there's a whole slew of different data points where people that are involved in clinical trials, either on a pharma life sciences side or as somebody being in that trial because they have some disease that needs to get addressed, or however all that sausage is made. It's interesting to have that secondary so we know that with the fake portal that somebody's trying to compromise us. So to me, that's totally cool about getting in front of ransomware. We've talked a lot about the strategies of, you know, the CFOs, like you know, however old they are, do they know how to buy crypto? You know, do you have an attorney to negotiate this? Like, what's the policy going to be? Yeah, because it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. But this is one, you know, piece of technology and a technique that gets you out in front of it. And like you talked about the fabric, we love the fabric because the 8 million firewalls correlate data with FORTIGUARD Labs, and then any of our other products that tie in, that gives you the force multiplier. But deception is like the coolest thing. You know, our first exposure to this was what, 2 years ago, and the customer was like, "I bought Deceptor. It took me longer to order it than you guys to put in the POC and turn on the keys." So hey, I came from a, you know, enterprise seller to where we had a lot of 3-year projects, and I know you were on the other end, like, all right, we're going to do this upgrade, and it's going to take us 3 years, and we're going to go and, you know, make sure that we refresh all this tech. You know, we don't want to assign a customer another 3-year project, so that's why I like this. We get, you know, the TCO is immediate value on what we do to get in front of it. It's not an expensive product, but if you're not a Fortinet customer, we'd love to make you Fort a family and back up a truck and talk deception. Nate, anything else you have on deception? Anything we want the, you know, all of our followers to know?
So in terms of deception, I think it's one of those things where I think we're used to, I think there's a lot of enterprise customers that have used it on the edge of their networks. I think for a lot of customers using it internally, it's a new concept, but I think it's one, it needs to become normal because really, when you think about it, think about the fact that how many stories do you hear of breaches to where the attacker was running around within a network for months, right? So this is one of those things to where, you know, these guys are, a lot of these threat actors are used to, once they're in, they just start looking around. They pay attention to borders, right? Like, okay, I'm within a segment. I know that maybe if I go over to this part of this system or architecture, I need to be careful because I might trip something. But think about the fact that you know, attacker thinks that they're within this regular section within a network, and they start looking at hosts and like, you know, I'm going to go look around a little bit here. It's a minefield at that point for them, right? So it really changes the game. I hate that phrase, but anyway, it really flips that around to where it's a much riskier proposition for them to be poking around. So I think it's a product that's well worth looking at. I think it really returns on the investment on it. So aside from Deceptor, one of the things, this isn't really getting ahead, but it's one of those things that I would be remiss in not mentioning. Do your tabletops exercises. What's going to happen if you do get hit, right? Like you mentioned, does your CFO not know how to buy crypto? There's a whole area of discussion that needs to happen beforehand that can save yourself a lot of headache later. Let's say if something does happen, you need to decide what would you do, right? What would you do if certain systems were not available, right? And you hope that never happens, right? But the reality is you really need to have a full picture and a full plan. And it's not wasted effort. Let's say a perfect world, you get ahead of this, you get all your ducks in a row, and ransomware is not a problem for you. That's great. But you know, so I live here in the middle of Oklahoma. Weather season's kind of wild here. So let's say you have an exercise to figure out what do you do if this particular system is down or unavailable. Well, who's to say you don't have a natural disaster that doesn't take that system down? So right. That's work well invested, so that you could reuse later. So I would just, you know, do your tabletop exercises, practice your backup and recovery. And that's just the operations guy in me from past saying you need to have a full plan. So
yeah, and I mean, talking about the natural disaster thing, so some customers are unfortunate that they've had to go through that, and they've identified that we can only recover, you know, these systems, and then they have the business continuity meeting with executives and say, okay, when we come back, we're only going to have Epic and Workday or whatever, you know, the systems, the time clock. So those things are important because we need to have people that are getting paid. We have to have access to records, and we have to be able to provide care. You know, we joke that we're young enough to remember that there was 2 Sundays a year that you'd have a DR exercise and everything went fine. Nobody's doing that anymore. There's, you know, you preempted me that I need to get the incident response team on, because they do the tabletop exercises. Regardless if you have cyber insurance, there's multiple things that need to get done to not only get back up and running, but let's figure out who's in here and then get them out. So, SOC as a service, incident response, those are two of our other fast growing products that people are like, wow, you guys do that? Yeah, we do. I mean, we see a ton of threat intelligence. I can't speak highly enough of what our FortiGuard Labs team and the value that they bring. But, I know Sean Riley, Mr. Walkie Talkie, he and Harris from our alliances team were out at S4. Moshe Ben Simon that runs this product for Fortinet, they had a full house. This is very prevalent in OT, pharma, healthcare provider environments. So we would love to have a deeper conversation about it with the local sales team, bring subject matter expert on. Nate and I can talk about it like this at a high level on what we see in the business value on it. Nate, any other thoughts on deception? I mean, it's one of the coolest things we got.
Can't think of anything right offhand. It's one of those things to where I think it is a very accessible technology. It's more accessible than most people realize, right? From a value perspective and from a just reliability in terms of a monitoring and a visibility tool, it's just really, really good. It's, to try to break it down into simple language. And it's just, I think it's so, I don't want to say it's so far out of the norm, but it's not something that traditionally that we've seen inside of a network, and people need to start considering it. It's, and the folks that our customers that have deployed it, they were very, very happy with how easy it was to deploy. It also gives you some visibility into your assets, right? It does have some inventory capabilities, which that is a consistent thing that I've seen across healthcare organizations, is a struggle with inventory of applications and assets and endpoints and infrastructure and all that, right?
Yeah,
give me a list right now of everything you have. They probably can't do it.
So if you don't know if you don't know what you have, you can't protect it. So the top two of the 20 security controls we have when we talk to customers about strategies about ransomware, it's not always about product or doing something with a security tool or adding people. The pandemic changed priorities in the provider space, and a lot of CMDBs and ServiceNow and asset tracking systems. If you don't know what hardware you have out in the wild or at every facility, and everybody's not accountable to making sure, how do you patch it, how do you protect it? And then the same thing with software controls. People are willy-nilly downloading stuff and you have no idea of blah, blah, blah software publishers patching, or you see something and you're like, oh, we don't own blah, blah, blah random software packager. That's one of the techniques in ransomware too, that is why customers get compromised. So, we don't want to see any customer get compromised. We're happy to talk through multiple tools. We have quite a few value-added resellers that we work with, because they do sell a multi-vendor solution with a immutable backup or connected medical. There's different things that we put in place to layer that security and put everything together so that you don't get compromised, or at least have a better chance. Because now we're talking, it's no longer when, it's a matter, it's not if, it's going to be when. So sorry, I messed up that. You know how my brain rolls. We've been on plenty of sales calls together. So, all right.
No, it's funny. You're talking about, people downloading software. For some reason, I had this whole thing of how many copies of unlicensed copies of WinZip are out there running around that people have downloaded that have just been sitting there that are probably 5 years old. So I don't know why that popped in my head.
So I was thinking about if anybody in the organization is still downloading Napster, because we're going to transition over to Tunes.
Hey, there you go. I don't know if it has any servers to connect to. What was some of and that's a whole other discussion. We can talk about WinMX and all those other ones,
Right, but I was just thinking like, hey, corporate network was better than DSL in 2001. So you went to work and tried to download Napster, and then somebody came up behind you and said, you're consuming too much bandwidth. We're running a business here. And you're like, sorry.
Hey, FortiGate can see that and stop that. So if you have a problem, I don't think Napster's around. I think it's like it's actual music streaming service now. So
yeah, I don't know what it is, but that's just what I thought of, because we're in that generation of like, wait a minute here. Wow, we can just share all these files, and nobody thought of anything of it. Now you're like, I wouldn't share anything with anybody. So it is what it is. But Nate,
we rent our music now.
Yeah, we pay 99 cents a month for an unquantified amount of music, but I still have plenty of CDs around. We spend a lot of time together. We always talk music or sports or whatever, but today the tunes. Let's transition over. It's like corporate Christmas for me. I can't believe it. Last time I did the vlog about Deceptor with Eric, Who's the band?
Stone Temple Pilots,
Stone
STP.
Temple Pilots, one of my favorites. So it's funny because we did the Deceptor with Stone Temple Pilots because we were in San Diego, and then you're like, "I'll be on," and you gave me a roster, but you're like, "STP is my number one choice." And I'm like, "Sounds like they're a Deceptor band." So Nate, why do you like STP?
It's interesting mentioning San Diego. I actually got to see, it wasn't Stone Temple Pilots proper, but Scott Weiland with Royal Machines in 2015 at Petco Park. They're opening for Aerosmith at the time. They did Plush and they did some covers. I can't remember what covers they did. I could probably Google it and see what they did. But I was glad I got to see them at the time because, you know, Scott Weiland passed away in December of that year.
Yep.
But I just remember it was the whole concert was awesome. So, but he just knocked it out. What was interesting about, I know I'm kind of straying a little here, but you know, Scott was kind of a tortured soul a little bit with, you know, he wrestled with addiction and all that. But if you, there's a lot of parallel stories of rock stars that had declines in wrestling with addiction, and you'd see their abilities fall apart and all that. The dude was knocked out of the park till the end, and it was just the rest of his life was a mess. But anyway, going back to Stone Temple Pilots. So, you know, I was in high school in the early 90s in the whole grunge area, which, you know, how fortunate were we to have that music around, right? It was just like
West. There will never be a better time.
Yeah. So there was a record store. So I grew up a little town in Northeast Oklahoma, but in Miami, Oklahoma, a town next to where I lived, there was a record store called Stick It in Your Ear Music. And it was run by a couple guys. They were music nerds. I think they were just not real good at running businesses, but we just go in there and, you know, it was the CD era and just bunch of, you know, homemade cases of CDs in literally, and this doesn't really happen anymore. You go in and say, "Hey man, what's good?" Or what's playing overhead, right? It's like, "Man, have you heard this? This is really good." And these guys would actually sell you stuff before it was actually released because they would get it in, but they didn't care. They just go ahead and then they say, "Hey, don't worry about the tax." They actually got in trouble for that. Don't worry, I'll cut you the tax. And then I don't know if
Uncle
the IRS
Sam always wants his dollar.
Yeah. But anyway, I remember getting my copy of Core from them. This is, I think, in 92. And I had an 87 Ford Thunderbird that the stereo system was probably worth more than the car, right? Alpine head unit, a 500-watt amp, 9 speakers, Rockford Fosgate 10-inch sub, and a 5th order box. And it just sounded wonderful. And, you know, that CD, I was thinking that Core was my favorite album of STP's, but I kind of realized that really it's the one I'm most nostalgic about.
Right.
Plush is just phenomenal song, right? It's my favorite from that album. So I have a lot of memories running around with my buddies, running around with that just cranked up. We used to drag Maine downtown with that in Miami. But then there's Purple, right? Yeah. So if I think back, really Purple's a better album.
Yeah.
But there was that transition, graduating high school, and you kind of got that summer of, I don't really know what I'm doing yet. I'm going to be starting college. It's kind of this new chapter. And Interstate Love Song, I think I probably had that on repeat 4 hours a day, right?
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, they had 7 studio albums. Some of what you're talking about, Scott Weiland created a lot of turmoil. They had like a linear chart. They probably had 20 albums, 16 of them good. They were on MTV when MTV actually played videos. Like, you're talking about nostalgic. The first time I remember seeing Black Hawk Down, that was 10 years after, and they were, the Creep was in the background at the beginning of Black Hawk Down, and all that stuff happened. It was like, holy smokes, Orlando Bloom standing there dribbling a basketball. You're like, that's what I was doing, dribbling a basketball, listening to STP, and I had no idea what I was going to do at 19 years old anyway. So it's wild stuff. So when we tie into the tunes, Nate, because obviously we grew up in different towns in the same era. You get the first pick because you're the guest. What ties into Ransomware, Deceptor? What do you got?
Okay, so I'm going to go with a song from Purple. It's Vaseline for Deceptor.
That was my first pick too, but
shooting fish in a barrel, right? So, flies into Vaseline. Okay, what's real and what's for sale? Search for things you can't see. I mean, the lyrics just kind of tie into it, right? It's this whole, this whole what's real and what's not, right? So I think it's a good tune for Deceptor, right?
So I'm going to take two like fantasy football here, and I'm going to go because Vaseline was my number one pick. I'm like, makes total sense with Deceptor. I got you off of number 4. I got you because I got you trying to break into my network. So I like that with Deceptor.
Okay, yeah.
And then I got Big Empty, which is not on one of my favorite albums, but Big Empty, if you're trying to break in and the Deceptor gets you, you come up Big Empty. And I kind of like that. What else you got? Because I know this is like in our wheelhouse of like, we're going to listen to this for a while.
Okay, so let me see here. And I kind of lean towards the first two. It's kind of, if I had to chart, number 4, I don't know a lot of the songs on, the Tiny Music was okay, but
number 4,
so let
like
me see here.
Sour Girl's like the biggest one off of number 4. You have to be in a mood to listen to number 4.
Well, what's interesting is, and I'm veering again here, but their sound changed over time, right?
Correct.
So, and they're still kicking, right? They got a guy named Jeff Gutt. He's a really good singer. But if you listen to their latest album, it's like, this isn't really an STP traditional album at all, but it's good. Okay, so back to the task at hand here. So let me see here. So I'm going to go ransomware in general here. I've got a couple listed here. I'm going to go with Meat Plow. Off of Purple. So in this song, it reminds me a little bit of Outshined by Soundgarden, because that guitar just comes in and just hits you upside the head like a brick, right? So in the reason I'm going with ransomware on that, so a lot of times I don't think people realize a lot of ransomware, you're not getting any time. If you've got an infection, you don't have the control, it's just going to run through. I don't know if you've ever, you've stood inside of a data center next to a storage array or a rack of compute, and that compute has been given a task to do something. You can hear fans spin up, you see LEDs get faster, you can feel the surge of activity going on, right? So if you think, this song sounds like a tank moving through. So if you think about what ransomware does a lot of times, ransomware is like, let's call an encryption function and let's get these CPUs going as hard as we can to lock this data up so we can extort money from people. So for some reason, and I tried to reverse engineer what the lyrics on this is. There's like 80,000 different interpretations. I'm going off the music on this one because it just sounds mean. Mean, and it just feels like a ransomware song.
And that's a good correlation with all the discs spinning up and the lights, and you're like, what are we doing?
It's a total nerd feel thing, right? I know people like it's dorky. Well,
well, hey, we're trying
some
to
people like
hey, if they don't like it, they can have their own show where they correlate the music, the technology, the trend. Like we're doing.
Some people like they think of gasoline and dragsters, and me it's like, okay, we just completely tapped out some CPUs and some disk, right?
That's what it is. And I get it, man. So let's shoot over here and transition, because they had a wide body of work, fairly wide body of work, but covers. I'm gonna take a couple here. They had a great Unplugged, because when everybody did Unplugged, because then you could tell they really could play. But Plush on Headbangers Ball, when they did that, when MTV played music, everybody, when you stayed up till 2:00 in the morning, now none of us can because we're old. And then the other one, this is the big Deceptor one, is, in my opinion, is it was Velvet Revolver Slither. Okay, so Ransomware slithers through a network, but you got Scott Weiland singing with the Guns N' Roses band, so it sounds like STP and it sounds like Guns N' Roses, but you're like, Scott Weiland's the front man, and Slither's one of their marquee songs that Guns N' Roses still plays, which they do a nice job, but it's not Scott. But that's like total deception the first time you hear it, circa 2006 when it came out. But yeah, I love, Scott Weiland's probably, arguably the best front man of that 90s generation, is a pure, front man. I don't know if he could play the, tambourine or anything, but you got anything else on the covers end?
Oh, covers. They had some pretty good covers. Let's see. There's a couple, right? So they did a cover of Break On Through by The Doors.
Ooh.
Which honestly, I think for segmentation, I think is a pretty good analog there. And And they also did a cover of Revolution by the Beatles. Now, what's interesting is I cannot find, you can actually find it on YouTube.
Yes.
It's not on Spotify and all that. So I think Revolution, I think you can define that with, I think, the security fabric is revolution of security. I think that's where everybody needs to be going. I think it's where you're going to see everybody go. And Deceptor's part of that fabric. So yeah, there's dancing. They also did Dancing Days by Led Zeppelin, but I just
Yes. So I have Dancing Days just because Ben Smith was on and he was a big Led Zeppelin guy, and they do a great. It's on Encomium, which they have 20 different artists, all great tunes. But
that's a good album.
I knew because that's when we bought albums. I don't notice I don't talk anymore about how many albums they sold because nobody buys albums. Their most underrated album, though, lasting on STP, their most underrated album was the self-titled one from 2010. That's probably their most musically unbelievable album. The other stuff is more tied into like, talking about cruising or lifting or sorority sing or whatever it might be. Anybody that I went to school with and knows that was some sorority sing, I'll send you some Fortinet swag if you actually watch this whole thing. But yeah,
it's a little unfair because I've talked a lot about Scott Weiland. The rest of the guys in the band are really good musicians. I mean, they're really good, and they're still at it. So,
well, that's awesome. Well, Nate, I really appreciate you coming on. Like I said, it's a joy working with you every day. We talk to customers, partners. If you want to get a hold of us, healthcare at Fortinet, pharma at Fortinet. I'm on LinkedIn, a little bit on Twitter, but connect up with us. If you want to see the Deceptor demo, we're happy to engage the broader team, local sales team, and rock and roll. Thanks for tuning in. Put the hammer down, the pedal to the metal. Thanks.